Do you ever wonder if your own personal backstory will be good enough to warrant its own whole episode of a television show, or if it's just going to be relegated to one of 4 short stories like this one? Or am I just too much of a nerd to think about my own backstory as, a TV show? Hello, interwebs! I'm here to review the latest episode of Star Trek Prodigy Season 1, Episode 16, Preludes. And as per usual, I'm going to stay spoiler-free up front, and then we're going to get into spoilers. But before I get into non-spoiler stuff, I do have 2 things that I need to say up front. The first is to be very excited about the fact that we are getting actually more Prodigy episodes right away. If you caught my last episode review, I said in that one I wasn't sure if there were going to be more Prodigy episodes immediately after these first 5 episodes of the second half of the season, because that's how they had split up the first half of Season 1, sort of splitting it up by 5. And I actually recorded that review actually well over a month ago, so I just got a new batch of episodes that CBS sent to me. I get screeners and stuff like that, and when they initially sent me the first batch of screeners, I was like, I don't know if they're gonna send me any more. Is this it? They haven't announced anything, so I'm just very glad and excited that we get to continue on with Prodigy, and it's not gonna be split up amongst like several months of waiting like we did with the first half, because I think that does a real disservice to this series on the whole, and I'm just glad because I'm really excited to continue on the show because I've been really enjoying it. A couple bumps here and there, but overall this back half of the season has been great, and that is continued in this episode. But the second thing that I needed to talk about was y'all haven't called me out. Like, dang, all of you were like, Jesse, you got it wrong. And I'm like, come on, okay, it was an honest mistake. Was the fact that I miscalled that the reveal at the end of last week's episode where Ensign Asenia is from the same species as the Diviner. I said that she must be a future Gwen, which is totally not the case. As we get revealed in this episode, she is a completely new character. But forgive me this one mistake, because we've already been dealing with time travel in this show, and we were already told that the Diviner and Gwen were the only 2 left of their species. So forgive me for making that assumption. You guessed it was an assumption, my mistake, but god dang it, come on guys, let me make one mistake, damn. I'm kidding. I love you all. You were right to call me out. I messed up in that one. But I just had to make a joke of it. Anywho, those 2 mistakes aside, let's jump in. Well, one of them was a mistake. Anyways, let's jump into the non-spoiler review. This episode, I will say, is kind of a cute one that I don't have a ton to say about, because it is actually kind of an anthology episode where we get to see, for the most part, the backstories of our other characters who we haven't learned much about their histories yet in the show. Dahl and Gwen are kind of the lead characters in terms of our hero protagonists, and so the rest of the characters are sort of haven't gotten a ton of time to we've gotten hints of their backstory but not a ton of it, and so this is just sort of filling in those gaps. And there's a little bit of part of me that is a bit disappointed that we don't get whole episodes focused on these characters' backstories, because I think all of them could warrant it, some more than others for sure, but I think to a degree they really could have. But I think the show is sort of smartly making the decision to be look, these are their backstories, but we really want to propel the story forwards. We don't want to be stuck in trauma and mysteries and things like that. Gwen and Dahl had the big mystery box story that has gotten and unfolded very well. And I don't want to say mystery box, because mystery box is a separate thing from how this was actually written. The characters clearly had an intentional arc and backstory when the show began, and not a nebulous one. But anyways, there was a big mystery around those characters' backstories. So I think not having the rest of the characters have these sort of big traumatic or big mystery backstories and just sort of getting it over with is a smart move, even though I think they could have had a whole backstory warranted to them, but I think that overall this is the smart move forward. The other thing that we do get, though, is a big backstory around some of the mythology of the series that I won't spoil here in the spoiler-free section, but I think works really, really well, and I think was somewhat necessary around this point in time for the series to sort of propel our series forward and not be focusing on what's the big mystery backstory. I think we need to be done with that. I think they sort of answered most of the questions that I had, and it really just leaves us going off of all right, the rest of the show is just focused on going forward. There's not really much looking back, and there might be some elements that come back up from these backstories, and I think I have a few ideas of what might, but overall this story is one that just pushes forward, and I'm very excited about it. One other thing about this episode that I kind of thought was interesting was this episode's structure reminded me a lot of this book, Star Trek Pathways, by Jerry Taylor, who was the executive producer for a time on Star Trek Voyager, and she wrote this book which was sort of going through the different backstories of all the Star Trek Voyager heroes. main characters, heroes, same thing, for the series, anywho. And this episode kind of gave me a similar vibe as this book, which I thought was an interesting sort of connection, considering that Prodigy is very associated with Voyager as a series. So, this isn't a new idea. A bunch of shows have done this, like, anthology backstory thing, but it's just sort of like, oh, that's an interesting connection with the Voyager thing. So I thought, maybe they were inspired by this to write this episode, the writers of Prodigy. More than likely they weren't, because again, this is not a new structure by any means, but it was an interesting connection. Thought I'd mention it. Anyways, let's get into spoilers. So, starting off, I really loved the framing story of this episode, where we start with Admiral Janeway, who, by the way, is listening to classical music, because apparently every Starfleet captain needs to be listening to, like, Bach or Mozart or something, and I get it. They're all pretentious, artsy-fartsy people. But come on, can we get someone who just, like, listens to, like, I don't know, the Rolling Stones or something? Like, this is why I loved Chris Pine's Captain Kirk. Like, say what you will about the Beastie Boys and the Calvin Timely movies, I actually loved them, especially in Star Trek Beyond. But that's beside the point. Anyway, we have Janeway listening to classical music here, and I like that her captain is sort of coming in and saying, like, look, we've got these dossiers on these people now, or at least, like, this wanted story. And I liked at the end of the episode, when we sort of end the framing of, like, Janeway looking at these sort of wanted bounties for the kids, she comes to the smart conclusion that, like, these are just kids, and maybe we should actually be looking for the person who put the bounty out on these kids, the diviner, who she just has a name of, and not knowing that he's literally on her ship. And I like that, because I've seen some frustration from some of my fellow fans of, like, Janeway would be smarter than this. And I've kind of bought, like, just with the information she's had, this is the direction she would take, because she's always been aware that these are kids, but still being, like, kind of hesitant about them, which I think is the smart move given the situation. But not, like, being like, yeah, let's go after these kids. They're obviously criminals. Like, but she's aware of the nuances of it, even if she doesn't have full information. And here she makes the correct deduction that these are just kids, so maybe we should be looking at that other person. I thought that it just showed Janeway's intuitiveness in a way that I think fully encapsulates the information that she has, but allows her to be smart. And so hopefully that'll assuage some people's frustrations that they've had, because I actually really like that nuance with their character. But then, sort of jumping around the frame story, we also jump over to our protostar crew, who are hanging out fixing the ship. Dahl is still understandably a little bit perturbed based on the information he learned last week about him being an augment, which I think, understandable. He's being a bit of a jerk, but give him some time. He's dealing with a lot. Understandable. But this just opens up to us for a chance to get to hear our characters' backstories. And I really like this. I like the characters just sort of sitting down and being like, hey, we're going to hang out and talk and just, be open with each other. Because not only does it allow us to have these, like, little short story vignettes throughout the episode, but also highlights that these characters have come to trust each other. This is not something they would have done in episode 1 or 2 or 3, but now they have gotten so far and they trust each other, they're willing to open up in this way. And it, as Rock Talk says at one point in the episode, it helps to talk about it. And I really like that they have come to that. And so this anthology story is something that, like, really also is evoking the trust that these characters have, and them bonding and being willing to spend time with each other and learning about each other rather than just going off in the holodeck, as Dahl suggests they do at one point. I really enjoyed that. But getting into these stories, there's some that I like more than others. We start off with Rock Talk's one, which I really did enjoy. It is a story that is a little bit tale of Ola's time. Like, Rock Talk was seen as a monster just based on her looks, which, we understand how people get stereotyped for how they look, whether it be like a big dude being seen as, like, he needs to be tough, or like me as a trans person, like, being seen as, like, weird or strange, or in certain situations. A lot of outsider people face this stigma in this way, and so Rock Talk facing that and then having to go into, like, be in this big show where she is the villain made sense. But what I really loved in some of the nuance of this story was that the hero, the person that was her acting partner, seems like actually a nice dude who, like, was playing the part and liked being the hero, but, like, when Rock Talk shifted it up because she wanted to do something different, not be seen as villain all the time, and do comedy, the hero guy was like, yeah, I'm here for it, I'll support you. And while it didn't work out for Rock Talk, she literally got sent off to jail for, like, wanting to do a comedy instead of a drama. I mean, like, comedy is way more fun than, like, that boring, like, oh, hero beats the villain sort of thing. So I was like, pay more for that. But anyways, literally gets sent off to prison for that, which is a lot. But I like that the hero guy felt bad, and I'm curious if that character will come back up in future seasons, if we'll see him. Because I like that he seemed like a decent dude, if stuck in a very similar situation to Rock Talk and perhaps benefiting more. But still like being understanding her, I thought was nice. We then jump over to, we have Zero's storyline, which I thought was the weakest of them all. It was fairly bog standard, and not that it was bad necessarily, but it was like, yeah, they were a Medusan, they got captured by, like, Kazons who were trying to go after them, and eventually they were sent to Tars Lamora. It's fairly like 1, 2, 3. We kind of can guess where that story went. So I don't have much to say about it. So that was the one that disappointed me the most, or it was just more or less like, that was fine. Jake and Pogs was fun. I did really like to learn that Jake and Pog is from a pre-Federation Tellar Prime, which it makes sense why he would not know what the Federation was, because that was something I was curious about. How could a founding member of the Federation, or at least someone from the founding member of the Federation, not know what the Federation is? And that he was sent into cryosleep, which also explains why he was so far out in the Delta Quadrant, which also worked really well for me. I thought this was really clever, and also gave us a little bit of a evocation of Tellar Prime history, which is something we haven't gotten a ton of within Star Trek. So I thought that was kind of nice. And then it was just a comedy beat where like he has to fix a bunch of stuff, and then it has to start talking about himself in the third person. Hence why he says Jank and Pog all the time, which I thought was a nice little note to sort of evoke that. And just to that robot, it was relatively funny. It wasn't anything super like crazy over the top, but I thought it was a funny little backstory. So all of that was great. But then this leads us to perhaps the biggest moment of the episode, which is we get to go back to the Diviner and we meet the Vindicator, who is the other member of his species, also from the future. And we get a big sort of exposition dump. And I love the visuals, like the art on this story was really, really great. But eventually we kind of get a reiteration of what the Diviner had already told us back in the mid-season finale, where his people sort of met the Federation. They sort of debated over whether they wanted to join the Federation, and ultimately destroyed themselves, and the Federation said, well, we'll just wash our hands of it. They blamed Starfleet, and suddenly the protostar, which was captained by Chakotay, fell into a time rift, and then they tried to use the protostar to go back in time and change everything in the way that we know that was the series plan, but Chakotay broke out and managed to send the protostar back in time, which means then that Chakotay's stuck in the future, a future that may have been erased, given what's going on here. So does that mean that Chakotay will not be saved anymore? Is it possible to save Chakotay if he's stuck in a future that may have been altered? It's sort of that same question of that happens to, if anyone remembers the TV show Heroes. I loved that show as a kid, even though it was very up and down as a show. But there was in season 2, there was a storyline where a character went to the future, got left in the future, then that future got erased. And it's like, does that person exist anymore? What does that even mean? So big questions on what's going to happen to Chakotay, if he even exists anymore. I'd be very curious to see how that's going to come back around. So that was interesting, but then we also learned that the Diviner was not the last of his kind, but he thought he was, because his species sent the last of all of their people back in time to try and find the protostar, and he saw everyone else get destroyed. But obviously the Vindicator was there as well, with a new deadlock. So this deadlock that she has is not the same one that we had, or sorry, Dreadnought, I should say, was not the same as the one that we had seen before, which was confusing me, because I'm like, I guess he can 3D print himself, but I'm curious because I thought we saw him die. So this is a new one, which I like because it's a creepy design, and I think they're really cool. Yeah, so that's the backstory. Hey, this is, again, a bit of an expo dump, but one that, like, fills out everything well, answers a lot of my questions, has some interesting, like, timey-wimey questions about Chakotay, but does answer what happened to him for us, and I'm curious to see where that goes. And it ends with Janeway getting bonked on the back of the head by the Diviner, as she starts to realize what might be going on with all the kids. So that is generally my thoughts on this episode. Overall, it was good, but not one that I would, like, write super much home about. It was a bit of an expo dump with a couple little fun beats here and there, but generally just fine. So yeah, this was a good episode. Didn't love it, didn't hate it, but I thought it answered a bunch of questions. But what did you think of this episode of Star Trek Prodigy? I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below. But beyond all of it, thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you all, my friends, live long and prosper.